Idaho Matters podcast is brought to you by St. Luke's On-Demand Virtual Care, which allows patients to see a provider from their home using a computer or smartphone with on-demand care for common ailments, such as a cough, sore throat, or a sinus issue. More information at stlukesonline.org.
Laws are being drafted and debated at the State House right now. Laws that will likely affect your everyday life as an Idahoan. The Connector helps you keep up with the legislative session with clear reporting, local context, and explanations that make it all make sense. Stay connected to the State House with the Connector, Idaho Daily News. Listen wherever you get your podcasts.
From the studios of Boise State Public Radio News, I'm Samantha Wright, filling in for Gemma Gaudette. You are listening to Idaho Matters, and it's Friday. Time for our Reporter Roundtable, where we get you up to date on all the news that made headlines this past week. Today, our panel includes Sarah Cutler with the Idaho Statesman, Emma Epperly with Idaho Education News, Kyle Fawnensteel with the Idaho Capital Sun, and Drew Dotson, reporter and editor for the Valley Lookout. Everybody, hi and happy Friday.
Happy Friday.
Okay, let's jump right in. And Kyle, I'm going to start with you and what I am calling the dental cut, for lack of a better phrase. Let's talk about Idaho's budget. The state is wavering between having a shortfall, maybe having a little bit of a cushion. Governor Brad Little is proposing some cuts to the Medicaid budget to make sure the budget is balanced, because that's in our Constitution. So we heard a little bit about what Little was thinking in his State of the State speech. Now you have more information. How much does he want to cut from Medicaid?
Yeah, so there was a little bit in the State of the State address, but a lot was in the governor's budget plan for the year that he submits to the legislature. So in that plan, he's proposing $45 million in state cuts to Medicaid next fiscal year. Those cuts can come in two ways. About half of it could come from extending cuts to doctor pay rates. The Department of Health and Welfare made those cuts this year, which are about 3% cuts in response to the governor's order for budget holdbacks. The other half of the governor's proposal for Medicaid cuts next year is about $22 million, and that could come from cutting quite a few Medicaid services. There's a big list he gave to the legislature for those services that could be cut, and dental is one of them.
And two of those stood out, at least to me, cutting dental care and then also home and community-based services. And you had a breakdown of how much people use those, how many people use those. Tell us what you found out.
Yeah, so a lot of people use these Medicaid services. If we just look at dental, that's more than 200,000 Idaho adults who are on Medicaid use dental. That's both folks who are on Medicaid expansion and traditional Medicaid. That's a lot of the Medicaid population overall. We have something like 350,000 people. Dental services cover preventive services, and it costs about $5.5 million in state general funds to cover those. And then home and community-based services covers a lot fewer people, but it's more expensive. These are services that are meant to help people with developmental disabilities live outside of institutions. That's their main other option for care if they're not receiving home and community-based services for the type of care they need for this. So this home and community-based services basically brings the care to their home. About 16,000 Idahoans are receiving these, and it costs the state about $176 million in state general funds a year.
Well, and you look into, there's a lot in here, in the couple of stories that you've done on this so far, and you look into things like not only how much it would cost, but maybe some of the downstream effects that might happen if these things were cut, like where would these folks go if they could no longer be in their homes without these services? So what happens now? These cuts are proposed by the governor. And it sounds like from your reporting that health and welfare committees, there's a House and a Senate committee, they're going to have a say in all of this.
Yeah, so first I can touch on the downstream effects. Medicaid is super, super complicated, and I think a lot of folks in the legislature acknowledge that. Just yesterday, the director of Medicaid was testifying before the legislature's budget committee, the Joint Finance Appropriations Committee, and she talked about how difficult it is to try to tease out what happens if we cut this service. What what other costs does this introduce the state to? And it's really complicated, and it also relies on a bunch of assumptions about what will happen. The state has looked into what would happen for repealing Medicaid expansion in the past. In 2023, they said it would cost the state $78 million more. But for some of these cuts that are proposed now, I don't know. I don't think there's a really clear picture of what downstream effects to the state budget it'll cause if we cut X and Y services. But in terms of what happens next in the political process, it's still pretty early in the legislative session, and there's a good way to go. Right now, the budget committee, JFAC, they set the budgets, and that will go up for official votes in the House and Senate to become laws. But it sounds like JFAC wants to hear input from the House and Senate Health and Welfare committees on how to get to these $22 million in cuts. What services do we cut? Do we look at the governor's list? Do we do something else? The House committee is brainstorming what to do right now. I think they plan to deliver their recommendations to JFAC in early February. That timeline could change as well. And the Senate committee is still figuring out next steps. On Monday, they plan to have a hearing about the Department of Health and Welfare's overall budget, and I think we hope to know more soon about what the next steps are.
Absolutely. And can we crawl into the Wayback Machine for a minute? Because I remember covering the last time Idaho cut dental care for folks on Medicaid, and that didn't end well, right? That didn't last long.
That about sums it up. I wasn't covering the legislature at the time, but I've heard a lot about this, and folks are talking a lot about it as we talk about cutting Medicaid services, about the downstream effects. So this was back in the Great Recession that the legislature cut adult dental services. They did this in 2011 for adults, and at the time they were hoping to save money, but only a few years later, costs in emergency rooms soared, and the legislature brought back dental coverage. And at the time that they brought it back in 2018, restoring Medicaid dental coverage was estimated to save the state $2.5 million.
Wow. Okay. We know you're going to be following the budget, which is going to be the big thing this year. And we know you're going to be following Medicaid. So thank you, Kyle. And Sarah, I want you to jump kind of onto this because your story this morning dovetails into what Kyle's talking about. You reported Health and Welfare has put caps on how many therapy appointments they can get from Medicaid. So what's going on here? Because this went through Health and Welfare.
Yeah, so on January 8th, the Health and Welfare Department announced that it was changing its rules for Medicaid patients about therapy appointments. So that's like physical therapy, occupational therapy, that kind of thing. And it put annual caps on basically that you could have 20 of each type of appointment unless the department gives prior authorization for more. So in other words, these appointments might still be available, but the department is sort of raising the burden of proof on patients and providers to access those therapies. And I should be clear following Kyle's comments just now that we actually didn't hear from Health and Welfare officially about whether this was a move to save the state money. That's our impression, but it's not something they confirmed.
Gotcha. And the new cap is 20 sessions a year, I think, but they may be able to get more. How do they do that?
Yeah, so patients probably, would still be able to access more with prior authorization from the department, which is something that providers would have to ask for. But I think where we were seeing a lot of anxiety from both providers and from parents here is that it's kind of unclear right now how that would be implemented, what the bar would be for that authorization, how often families would have to re-up it. Is that every 20 appointments? Because for kids with serious disabilities, as one example, 20 appointments might last about a month, and each one could be hundreds of dollars out of pocket. So we were hearing a lot of anxiety about the specifics.
Yeah, and you talk to advocates, you talk to parents, and some of these stories are kind of scary. What else are they saying about the new cap? I mean, this could hurt kids who really rely on these kinds of services.
Yeah, we were definitely hearing frustration from providers and parents, that, from their perspective, there's already a lot of red tape to access Medicaid care for these kids. This is yet another hoop to jump through. Similarly, as I mentioned, there's some angst about the way this has been rolled out with very little communication and a lot of confusion about the specifics of how it will play out. And then I think an important theme to pull out too was that everybody was emphasizing the importance of this therapy being consistent. that if kids can't access it regularly, they not only won't continue to progress, but might actually regress. And one other thing I'll note too is that I think for a lot of these kids with sort of very profound developmental disabilities, whose families we talk to, Medicaid is often kind of the only option. A lot of private insurers won't cover long-term disability care. So a lot of the families we spoke to pay for private insurance, but they also rely on Medicaid to kind of fill the gap in cases like this. So it's already serving as a stopgap, and we heard from parents that if access is limited or in the future is cut entirely, it could just mean kids can't access that care.
This too is another very in-depth story. We're going to put a link to it. Everybody recommend check it out. Thank you very much. Emma, I want to jump to an update you had on a law that kicked in, I think in July, that requires that parents opt in to human sexuality lessons for their kids. Can you quickly recap the law and what it says?
Yeah, so this is House Bill 239. You're right, became law in July. And it requires that teachers, that schools notify parents of instruction on human sexuality topics 2 weeks before the planned lesson. And then parents within a week of when the instruction is set to begin have to turn in an opt-in form. Human sexuality in the law is defined as discussion of sexual conduct, sexual pleasure, sexual intimacy, abuse, sexual violence, eroticism, pornography, deviant sexual behavior, sexual attraction, sexual orientation, or any form of sexual identity, gender ideology, or gender conversion. And so that's what the law says.
And it sounds like a very in-depth definition, but it sounds like some schools are not sure. You focused in on Meridian Medical Arts Charter High School and how they're complying, because they're complying just all over the board, trying to make very clear that they're not violating the law in any way. How much extra work has that created for them?
Yeah, so Meridian Medical Arts, obviously they have a unique curriculum. You can kind of tell by the name of the school. They're a charter school that focuses on medical fields. And so they have sent out 750 permission slips, 756 to be exact, last semester. And that teachers spent 46 hours combined spending just preparing those forms across 11 subjects. So the majority of those forms are in career and technical education, medically specific classes. So they've got one class where they learn about different drugs. It's a pharmacy assistant class. And so they learn about the top 200 drugs in the United States, most prescribed. And those often will have an impact on some part of a person's either gender or sex life, basically. And so they have to send out a lot of permission slips for that class. But they're also really erring on the side of caution when it comes to this law. So they are sending out permission slips for some really commonly taught novels like Romeo and Juliet or To Kill a Mockingbird that have elements that the school leader described as, hitting on this overarching human sexuality theme.
And you pointed out over 750 permission slips. How many parents didn't opt in?
So they haven't had anybody opt out of this instruction. And the school leader, Ben Merrill, said that he is just hearing a lot of complaints from parents about just the fatigue of filling out these permission slips. They're annoyed.
What about other districts? Because, all the districts, I'm guessing, have to comply with the law in some form. What else did you find out?
Totally. So we reached out to quite a few districts across the state, and the majority of them said they're not tracking this. They're not tracking the number of permission slips. A lot of the districts are just having this be handled at the building level, so they don't have like a district-wide total. Coeur d'Alene School District, they said the majority of families opted in to receiving reproductive health instruction. So 97% of middle school families and 90% of high school families opted in. And they said they're really just sending permission slips out um, for things that deal with reproductive health, for sexual conduct, basically. Lessons that might deal with, physiology and anatomy of the human body, they are not sending permission slips out for, even if they do include the reproductive system, because they argue that's not sexual conduct.
Fascinating story. Thank you, Emma. Drew, your turn. There are some changes coming to the McCall Winter Carnival. What's different this year? Because it's coming up fast.
Yeah, so there's really kind of two main changes to keep in mind. The first one being that, after the last couple years, the last 2 years anyway, the carnival has been held over 3 days in late February rather than historically 10 days at the end of January into early February. So that's the first change, is this year we're going back to the 10-day model. And the other big change associated with that, and it's kind of comes in the same vein as the switch back to the 10-day model, is the Mardi Gras parade, a longtime staple of the carnival for anybody who's been. That will actually not be held until the second weekend of the carnival. Traditionally, it's always been on that first Saturday of the first weekend, kind of like a kickoff event for the carnival. Now, starting this year, and we don't know about beyond this year, but certainly for this year, it'll be on that second Saturday, February 7th. It'll still go through downtown McCall and all that. It's just the organizers, the McCall Chamber of Commerce, thought that, by moving it to that second weekend, it might actually kind of spread out to the iconic carnival events, if you will. You've got the snow sculpture viewing going on for the entire 10-day event. You've got fireworks both weekends, but by putting the parade that second weekend, the hope is that there's more of a draw and that kind of the tourism that flocks to McCall during that time gets spread out over both of the weekends.
And this is a big moneymaker. I mean, this is the big winter moneymaker for McCall. And the carnival was struggling financially this time around. So tell me how Charlie helped make sure that we had the carnival this year.
Sure. So you're referencing the Charlie's Fan Club campaign, which was started by the chamber over the summer, I think it was. I think it was August or September that they came out with that. And basically the issue was, after last year's parade, there was a $20,000 funding shortfall that the chamber had to eat, and essentially for the long-term sustainability of the program, they were kind of like, hey, we need to close that. And
Mm.
so Charlie's Fan Club was a donation campaign that was started, and kind of the novelty behind it all, I suppose, is that, for any donation of $10 or more, for the first 1,000 anyway, uh, the donor would receive a Charlie's Fan Club button, like a button pin. Um, and so that effort in and of itself is ongoing, but so far has raised over $2,000, in addition to some larger sponsorships from local businesses, Tamarack Resort being one of them, that have closed the funding gap for this year. They're on sound financial footing once again, but moving forward, they plan to continue that campaign. And just to kind of give a sense of, what it is that we're really talking about here, it's a parade. How expensive could it be, right? I mean, the number two, the top two most expensive elements of the parade, one, are closing down the highway through McCall, right? I mean,
Mm.
you're talking about a state highway system and all the traffic control that's associated with that. That's in the neighborhood of about $30,000 alone,
Wow.
for the carnival to just shut down the highway for a couple hours. That's the cost.
Wow.
Um, and then one of the other big costs is porta potties. You've got tens of thousands of people on the street and just staging porta potties around town for that capacity. I mean, that's another key expense. And so between those things and the growth in McCall and the growing popularity of the carnival, it's just gotten more and more expensive, and so that's kind of where the chamber's coming from on all this.
And I could see where Charlie Pins would be a hot item, given that Charlie is the Loch Ness monster of McCall. So, when does the carnival kick off again? When is opening day?
We're a week out. Next Friday, January 30th. That'll be kind of the kickoff of all the various different carnival festivities. If you're interested in a full outline of those events, you can certainly find one on the McCall Area Chamber website. They've got a great guide. And so starting next Friday and then continuing through February 8th.
All right, Drew, thank you. Sarah, daycare fraud in Minnesota has made national news. You're reporting Idaho Republicans are worried that it may be happening here. Do we know if that's true? Do we have any numbers? How do we know?
Yeah, so at the moment we have limited data on what is happening in Idaho, but what we do have shows quite a low rate of fraud, about 1%. Specifically, we have audits from the Department of Health and Welfare, which oversees daycare subsidies in the state. We have their data going back to 2022, showing that in a little over 1,000 audits, they found 16 cases of poor business practices in which there could be fraud. They noted for me that fraud has some specific legal definitions, so they don't assert that it's officially fraud, but they identified suspicious business practices in those 16 cases.
And you also looked at what some online activists are saying about potential fraud.
Yeah, I thought in the story it was really important to highlight how this conversation has evolved here in Idaho. So after, as you noted, the case in Minnesota has made national news, has been a really big deal. Um, Folks here decided to start combing through daycare data, or more specifically, data on daycares receiving federal subsidies. And because in Minnesota, a lot of the fraud seemed to connect with or stem from the Somali immigrant community, a lot of folks here basically were just noticing that many daycares in the state are owned by people with, I quote, foreign sounding names. So these activists online were not really providing additional evidence or suspicion of wrongdoing beyond the names of the providers. And one of them actually told me he had found no evidence of fraud, that he was mostly just speculating. But nonetheless, a narrative took hold that we might have a Minnesota type problem here. And it culminated a couple weeks ago in two Republican lawmakers calling on health and welfare to pause subsidies for daycares until there was more infrastructure for oversight in place. So the story or narrative kind of took on a life of its own without much in the way of real evidence.
And health and welfare is still investigating. When are we going to find out more from them?
Yeah, so in response to that letter I mentioned from lawmakers, Health and Welfare has beefed up its own oversight capacity to conduct a more complete audit, they said, of all of the providers that receive these subsidies. And it said that it would have results from that study in, it was 45 or 60 to 60 days, so in a month or two. So it's, notable that those results will come out right in the middle of the legislative session, and we'll certainly be following that closely to learn more about what they find.
Absolutely. Drew, what's the latest on Warm Lake Summit? It's open, it's not open, it might be open. Can Yellow Pine residents get out? What's the latest on this story we've been covering? We've been covering this with you for a little bit now.
Yeah, I was gonna say, gosh, it's kind of gotten to where there's so much background on this that I'll try and make sure I cover it all here.
Shrink it down.
Um,
60 seconds.
I think last time I was on the show, I think we talked about the landslide that took out a section of South Fork Road,
Yep.
which during a normal year is the only route for wheeled vehicles to reach Yellow Pine in the far eastern reaches of Valley County during the winter. And so that landslide took out a chunk of roadway, and there is at this point no timeline for repairs. It certainly sounds like spring or summer at the soonest. And so with that, the South Fork Road is off the table for winter access to Yellow Pine, which leaves Warm Lake Summit,
Summit.
which, for the last, about a month, maybe 6 weeks, has really kind of been front and center up here of a negotiation between Valley County and Perpetua Resources, which is the Boise mining company behind a golden antimony mine that was approved up there near Yellow Pine. Um, Really at the beginning of 2025 is when that approval was issued. And so as a result of that approval, Perpetua has been getting going on developing this mine. And as part of that, the road over Warm Lake Summit is their primary access to the mine. And so they've taken over snow removal from the county. And where traditionally the county has stopped snow removal in the decades past, kind of at the base of Warm Lake Summit, Perpetua is plowing it right on through and keeping that road open instead of being used as a groomed snowmobile trail as it has been. And so with that whole conversation came the discussion of, okay, well, what kind of public access restrictions should there be? Shouldn't there be? Will there be gates? Will there be avalanche closures? Will there be seasonal closures? All these kinds of discussions were happening as part of this. And then that kind of all, got stopped in its tracks by this South Fork Road slide that, the county they've got a responsibility to provide access to Yellow Pine residents. I mean, these people are Valley County taxpayers too. And so the the long and short of all of that is um, we know what the case will be for this winter, and that is the road will be open, barring an avalanche or barring extreme avalanche danger, anything of that nature. What we don't know is beyond this winter. Once South Fork Road is opened back up, what will that look like? Those conversations remain ongoing.
Wow. Okay. Emma, I'm just going to read your first line in this story. Just over 57% of Idaho students in grades K through 3 are reading at grade level or higher. So, where did this number come from, and why is it different, or possibly different, or the test was different from last time?
Idaho Reading Indicator. It is a test given twice a year to Idaho students in kindergarten through third grade. And the test is different this year because you can read all about it in the story. We go pretty in depth, but basically, there was a merger between the old test provider and the new test provider. Now they're one company, and the test is different. In the past, it used to be students would select the correct answer from multiple choice. They had options. Now, students read back to a computer. So they'll have a passage they need to read out loud off of the computer, back to the computer, and then the test uses artificial intelligence to kind of grade how well the student is reading. And so it is just a completely different model, and a lot of educators argue that this is testing a higher level of knowledge than the prior test.
Wow. And there's a ton of info in here, which is not unusual with Idaho Education News. You can actually see where your district falls in your story. There's a big range. Payette, I saw, was at 40.7% on the scale. Melba is 70.4%. So I guess my question is the overall 57% number good news or bad news for kids?
Well, I mean, I don't think anybody thinks that 57% of kids reading at or above grade level is good.
No.
But I think we should have a big asterisk next to this percentage because this round of testing is just totally abnormal. It's really hard to compare to prior years because of the new system. They also waited. Typically, they give the test right when kids get to school, late August, early September. This year, they waited till October so that teachers and schools and kids could have some practice on the new platform. I think there's two important things to know. One is that kindergartners did not do great. They had a 44% statewide reading at or above grade level, but third graders did much better, 65.6% reading at or above grade level. And then also, the fall IRI scores are always just like way worse than the spring because of that summer learning loss. So last year In the fall, 59.5% of students statewide were reading at grade level compared to 70.9% in the spring. So I really think, you're going to have to wait until the spring to see really how kids are actually reading. One more thing to note is that the third grade cohorts, if you look at the same class of kids from 2022 when they were in kindergarten to now when they're in third grade, they have shown improvement in their fall test scores. So it's really hard to know. Obviously, I think everybody would like the majority of kids to be reading at grade level. But I think when it comes to this test, we just really won't know much more until the spring.
It's fascinating. And everybody check out Emma's story because you can look up your district and see what your district is doing. Drew,
Yeah.
what's up with the drinking water plant in McCall? There's a big funding shortfall. How much money are we talking about?
Yeah, so we're still trying to kind of pin down exactly what the number is going to land at, but right now it sounds like that funding shortfall is anywhere from about 7 million to about 11 million dollars that are short on these capacity upgrades to the city's water system.
Yeah, because you've got the plant, you're just fixing it up. Is this about DEQ standards, and or having enough water in the summer, or both?
Uh, Both. It's so DEQ standards. Basically, the issue is that the surges in water demand that the city sees based on seasonality are so drastic that the city's treatment plant is not able to keep up. And really, what we're talking about here is, during most of the year in McCall, average daily demand is, right around 1 million gallons a day. But in the summer, that number jumps up to over 3 million gallons a day. And specifically, overnight during the early morning hours, when irrigation systems are running, and when people are showering. Those are kind of the two big water eaters. And so when that happens, the pumping capacity, the filtration capacity, the disinfection capacity of the water system is taxed to the nth degree. To the point that in recent years, the water plant has in fact received a handful of violations related to falling below DEQ standards um, for the water treatment process. And so these projects would basically double the filtration capacity of the water treatment plant. They would increase the disinfection capacity, and they would also add a new 2 million gallon water storage tank that would basically supplement the water system during these surges. Um, and so it's needed on the ground, no doubt about it, but there's also the regulatory aspect. The city has this hanging over their heads where um, DEQ is requiring them to do this.
Wow, and this all has to go to voters. So to be continued, I think.
Yeah,
Um,
the council last week they indicated that yes, they would like to go ahead and seek debt financing to cover this cost overrun. Um, This would actually be the second bond issue sought by the city for the water project back in May of 2024. They got a 16.5 million bond approved for the work. And then now that's proving not to be enough, mainly due to, I mean, there's a couple different factors and I think, let's face it, for years, the construction bidding environment in Idaho has been crazy for a while. But specifically, tariffs, and then the expensive local labor economy in Valley County were the reasons cited by city consultants for the high bids they're seeing.
wow. Okay, we did not get to all the stories today. My apologies to our reporters, and thank you, thank you, thank you for being here. We've been speaking with Sarah Cutler with the Idaho Statesman, Emma Epperly with Idaho Education News, Kyle Fahnensteel with the Idaho Capital Sun, and Drew Dotson, reporter and editor for the Valley Lookout. Check out all of their stories. We'll put some links on our website, boisestatepublicradio.org.
I'm Gemma Gaudette, and this is Idaho Matters.
Looking for another podcast to listen to? Check out The Nature of Idaho from our partner station KISU in Eastern Idaho. Join hosts Peter Pruitt and Dr. Leif Tapanilla as they share fascinating stories from the Gem State's great outdoors, celebrating Idaho's wildlife, landscape, and natural wonders. That's The Nature of Idaho from KISU. Listen wherever you get your podcasts.